Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, November 4th, 2021, and today we officially mark 2 days after the Virginia gubernatorial election that has many implications about the future and trajectory of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and what actually went down in the state of Virginia. Now, taking a look at this race, it was a very hotly contested one. For a long period of time, many people thought that Terry McAuliffe would undoubtedly be able to win this race. There was never meant to be a major form of competition, and as things started to get closer to the election season, it ended up going narrower and narrower to a point where eventually, a week before the election, Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, took over the Democrat Terry McAuliffe in this race. Now, the reason why this is such a surprising victory for the GOP is because of the fact that the state of Virginia is pretty Democratic. On the presidential level, Virginia has voted blue since 2004, the last time voting for George W. Bush by a margin of 8.2%. 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020, Virginia always went towards the Democrats. And the most interesting thing about it is that Terry McAuliffe actually served as governor and defied expectations back in 2013. But it looks like 2021 is returning to this trend that was actually set in place back in the 1970s. So looking at Virginia in the 2020 presidential election, another reason why it was surprising is because this state ultimately shifted towards the left. As you can see here, the majority of the counties in Virginia shifted towards the Democratic Party, most notably the Northern Virginia region, a region that is crucial in Democratic support. And with that region getting more Democratic, the state itself became the most Democratic it has been since the 1944 election. So for Joe Biden to be up so high in Virginia, then just a year later, quite literally, actually less than a year later, technically speaking, it goes to the GOP, you're talking about a shift that took place that was nearly 13 points statewide and is absolutely astounding that a Republican was able to win. Not even by a narrow amount. You know, looking at Glenn Youngkin's race, I predicted that he was going to win. I said that he was going to be the next governor of Virginia, but I was still apprehensive. I knew the race would be close, as it actually is technically close, but for a Republican, this is actually a pretty solid victory. I mean, you're not talking about the margin being less than half a point or less than a quarter of a point, as Georgia and Arizona were in the 2020 presidential election. You're talking about Glenn Youngkin shifting the state nearly 13 points right wing relative to 2020. So looking at the state itself, Glenn Youngkin has had a very, very good response here in the state. And you can see actually the shifts from the 2020 presidential election. And get this, while there may have been some counties that actually shifted to the right and to the left in the 2020 election in Virginia, every single county in Virginia in the 2021 election shifted towards the right. Every single one. There were no exceptions. There was not a single region in which Terry McAuliffe did better than Joe Biden. The only thing overarching was the fact that Terry McAuliffe, surprisingly enough, did better amongst minority voters. But the shift here wasn't minority voters that was able to make it so Youngkin could win, because obviously you now see that Youngkin did worse amongst minority voters than Trump. But actually, what happened was white women, a voting group that sometimes votes for Democrats, typically votes with the GOP, but votes with the GOP in a way that isn't nearly as large as white men. But then, in the 2021 election, shifted considerably towards the right. Many people attribute this to the issue of education and a lot of the more social issues that were mentioned in the state of Virginia. But I do want to say that this should be cautioned, because it was more than just Virginia that narrowed up in the past election. New Jersey was decided by less than a point. New York City ended up having more Republican support than people previously thought. Minneapolis and other places around the nation rejected propositions that made it so that more Democratic policies would be enacted or more progressive policies would be enacted. It seems as if 2021's election night was a big pushback on the Democratic Party, a major one, if I do say so myself. Because it wasn't just the governor election. Many people thought that there might be a split ticket ballot by the end of it. I had seen projections that said McAuliffe is going to lose, but Hala Ayala as a lieutenant governor is going to win, because Terry McAuliffe was the bad campaigner, but the rest were fine. Mark Herring as the incumbent won in 2013, won in 2017. Why wouldn't he win a third term? And you could ask the voters that exact question. But when it came down to the actual elections here, you can see here that the lieutenant governor's race went to Winsome-Sear. years, who actually ends up being the first woman of color, the first black woman in the state of Virginia to be elected as lieutenant governor. She has certainly made history, a huge advancement for people of color across Virginia, a big advancement for women across Virginia, a very, very big deal here. But the margin here was roughly similar to what we see on the gubernatorial level. I mean, you see here that the margin is 1.8% across the state. Taking a look at the 2021 Virginia race here, the margin seems to be 2.5%. So while the margin is higher for Youngkin, it's not as if there was some type of major difference between the lieutenant governor and also the attorney general's race, which I can show you now. The attorney general's race was decided by a margin of 1.4%. Yes, narrower than the governor level, narrower than the lieutenant governor level, but nothing super significant. You're talking about a point difference when people were expecting Mark Herring to potentially outrun Terry McAuliffe by a margin of 2, 3, sometimes 4 points across the state. Ultimately, it looks like this was a rejection of Democratic ideology, not only on the top of the ticket, but all the way through the bottom, because it doesn't end here. In addition to these 3 losses across the governorship, lieutenant governorship, and the attorney general's race, the loss also came in the House of Delegates, in which the Republican Party has officially won back control of the House of Delegates here, and Democrats have officially lost control. Now we are looking at a 51-49 House of Delegates if everything stands to date. I think that many of these results will not change, but the reason why they are still being held up is because there are mail-in votes that need to be counted in some of these closer states. Some of these closer districts. But ultimately, the Republican Party will at least prevent the Democrats from having a majority still because they have already won 50 seats, according to the Associated Press. In addition to that, many other political analysis networks and influential people have already said that 51 Republicans have been elected to the House of Delegates. We will see if that is walked back upon, but at the end of the day, personally, I do not expect that to change at all. I think it will be 51-49, and I think that this will be, yet again, another showing of lack of support for the Democratic Party, and it even extends down to this generic ballot. We don't know exactly how much the votes were cast across all of these tickets. You do also have to realize that there were, not as many Democrats on the ballot as there were Republicans, so it is very possible that Republicans would have that advantage just by being unopposed in certain districts and thus winning 100% of the vote rather than what would be maybe 60-70%. Obviously, in those unopposed districts, they're already safe. I'm not arguing that they're not. What I am arguing, though, is the fact that there may be some Democrats there that just voted for the Republicans simply because they were the only ones on the ballot. So I don't think comparing the actual overall vote statewide would be fair, especially since we already have governorship, lieutenant governorship, and attorney general's race to compare to the averages before. But you can see here that in the House of Delegates, the victory came because in 2019, the House of Delegates actually wasn't that large of a victory for the Democratic Party. Now, what the most influential one was in 2017. When Ralph Northam was elected governor, in which the Democratic Party picked up 15 seats statewide. The Democrats went from being in the super minority with Republicans at 66 out of the 100 seats in Virginia. Then you fast forward to 2017, 2 years later, the Democrats end up picking up 15 seats, and it ends up 51-49. The most interesting thing about this is that Republicans held the majority simply by a pulling of the name out of a hat, and the Republicans ended up winning that race. But then in 2019, Democrats came out in full force again and ousted all of these Republicans in these 6 individual seats. Consequently, the Democrats were able to win back the legislative branch here in the House of Delegates for the first time since 1993. The first time since 1993, a very considerable election for the Democratic Party in the House of Delegates here. So looking at what happened in 2021, it actually might be worse for Republicans than you might think. What I am shocked about is the fact that with these maps here, you are seeing the exact same result in 2021 as you saw in 2017. I think that it is just very interesting to note that even in 2013, when Terry McAuliffe won his race for the first time, that the Democrats only had 33 seats here. Well, if you fast forward to 2015, fast forward to 2017, 2019, then 2021, you're talking about practically the same constituents here. But 2021 only gives you the majority you had back in 2017 when Democrats won across the state by 9 points. That's why this is very interesting to me, because Democrats were able to win by 9 points and only got 49 seats. And here are Democrats losing and still winning 49 seats in the state of Virginia. I think this might be more of a testament to the fact that Democrats haven't seen that much erosion in support when it comes down to the House of Delegates, but there certainly has been a considerable amount, but based off of the overall composition here, we're not looking at 2013 reminiscent numbers, 2015 reminiscent numbers. You're talking about Democrats hitting what they hit just 4 years ago when the circumstances of the election were very, very different. And I find that to be just quite fascinating, to say the least, that Democrats really seem to have that advantage still kept with them, even though they were able to lose in a number of other considerable races. Now, looking at the state of Virginia, the polling data also was a major victor as a result of this Glenn Youngkin victory. It said on Real Clear Politics at 538 that Glenn Youngkin was going to win the race, and he did win the race. In fact, there seems to have been an underestimation of Republican support. 538 shift by 1.5% to the right, and Real Clear Politics by a margin of 0.8. That's actually very good for major polling firms. That's very good for all of these numbers. The Trafalgar Group seems to have gotten it right again in the state of Virginia, saying that Glenn Youngkin won by 2 points. Fox 5 DC Insider Advantage also said Youngkin would win by 2 points. Fox News is another victor, saying that the race was going to go to Glenn Youngkin. Emerson College predicted a tie and was within the margin of error by the time we had reached the final results. So you can see here that the polling data indicated that Youngkin was going to win, but many Democrats were optimistic that the polling data would be wrong. But ultimately, it was not. And as we typically know, in elections that do not include President Trump's name, the polling data is almost always spot on. And the interesting thing about Emerson College is that in all of the notable races in this 2021 election night, Emerson College came within 3 points of every single one of those races. New York City mayor, Virginia governor. When it came down to New Jersey, they were within a point where it looks like it's going to be within a 3-point interesting margin there. It really depends on what comes in with the mail-ins. But beyond that, I think there were 3-4 other races that Harry Enton had pointed out that Emerson College seems to have gotten down to a pretty good amount and within the margin of error that many people otherwise would not have been able to project. But you can see here that the Virginia polling data came as a response to Joe Biden falling out of favor across the nation. An argument can be made that education and local issues were the primary driving factor to why Glenn Youngkin won in Virginia, and I would agree to an extent. But I would also caution it by saying that Joe Biden undoubtedly had a very major presence in this race. You can see here that the approval rating of Joe Biden is about -8 points nationwide, and that's pretty bad. Looking at the approval rating here, at some cases, President Trump has a higher approval rating than President Joe Biden. Luckily enough for Joe Biden, 4 years ago today, and through this time period, Donald Trump was hitting his lowest point of his entire presidency. For Joe Biden's sake, I think he's hoping that this is his lowest point of his entire presidency. But the point being that the low approval rating ultimately resulted as well into lack of Democratic support in the state of Virginia. It took a time period, I would say, right when Joe Biden was unpopular, Terry McAuliffe wasn't losing immediately to Glenn Youngkin. But as the margin started to expand back in late or mid-October, you saw the margin go from what was 2 points, 3 points, and then narrowed up all of a sudden down to a 3-point margin here, and then started to expand. All of a sudden, right when Glenn Youngkin was starting to take the lead, the disapproval rating on the national level went from just -4, -5, all of a sudden to -7, now standing at -8. The approval rating changed, and this election was decided by such a margin that you actually see this exact change relative to when the polling data actually started to predict that Glenn Youngkin was going to win the race. I mean, you're talking about mid-October where Joe Biden was down -5, and now he's down -3. Well, Virginia actually shifted the way that the national numbers did for Joe Biden. You would see that Glenn Youngkin might have actually lost had the election been held 2-3 weeks earlier, simply because Joe Biden hadn't continuously fallen out of favor. I think a lot of things went into this victory for the GOP, but it was very substantial, primarily because Republicans have not won a major statewide election in terms of a statewide position since 2009. I mean, that was the last time the Republican Party had a major showing across the states. Even in 2014, Virginia's Senate election went blue. Despite it being very competitive, Democrats were able to survive. If Virginia has a Senate election up in 2022, which they do not, but if they did, I would not be so confident if I was on the Democratic side taking a look at this race and advising it to the DNC or advising it to Mark Warner or Tim Kaine when it comes down to that race. Virginia is competitive because Joe Biden fell out of favor, in addition to all of those factors that benefited Glenn Youngkin across this race. And now Republicans have a near trifecta in the state. They control the House of Delegates. They just won the House of Delegates here, as you can see. They've also won the lieutenant governorship. Not only the governorship, but the lieutenant governorship, and they got a historic first. In the 2021 Virginia Attorney General's race, they also had another historic first. This was the first Hispanic American to be elected as Attorney General of Virginia. Another first, but this time not on the side that likes to be the first in many of these cases. So the governorship gone, the lieutenant governorship gone, the Attorney General's race gone, and now the House of Delegates. I think in many cases we can expect the Republican Party to come for the Virginia State Senate in 2023. And the problem is for the Democratic Party is that they only have a 1-seat majority if this administration when this administration takes over. A 1-seat majority. Reminds you a lot of the 2020 Senate elections with the runoff elections included in that final map. So, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.